Sizzle story number one. Ben Bernanke and the Fed's ominous warning. Growth will be much slower than expected. Unemployment 8.6% a year from now. And the Fed stands ready to buy mortgage-backed bonds. More quantitative easing. How do we solve all this? Well, Congressman Ron Paul is our special guest tonight. We welcome back to the show Texas Congressman Ron Paul, who is obviously a Republican presidential candidate as well. He is also an expert on Federal Reserve policy following Ben Bernanke's news conference today. Congressman Paul, welcome back to the program. I just want to get your take, pick your mind on a couple of Bernanke's key statements. Probably the most provocative thing was he argued to help housing and to solve high unemployment, the Fed stands ready to buy mortgage-backed bonds, which would mean more quantitative easing. Your thought on more QE and buying bonds?
In a way, I think they're still in QE because he's guaranteed interest rates are going to stay about 0% for the next couple of years. But to buy more just exacerbates our problem. We're just transferring debt from one group to another group, basically to those who held these mortgages to the taxpayer. And I see no benefit from this whatsoever. I think we don't get the correction that we need. We need some of that debt liquidated. We need some of that malinvestment taken care of. We need prices to go down. So he's doing, from my viewpoint, exactly opposite of what he should be doing.
Well, that's interesting because some of the reporters asked him, given his relatively gloomy assessment of the economy, I mean, unemployment is expected to be near 9% even a year from now. What went wrong? We've had all this Fed activism, as you point out, zero interest rates, QE1, QE2. And Bernanke basically said bad luck. He basically said bad luck was the problem. What would you answer? How would you respond to Bernanke?
Well, you know, somebody asked me this yesterday, what should he do? And I said, well, what I would really like to hear is that he's thrown in the towel and he's given up, that he admits that his theories are wrong and that all this QE stuff doesn't work. But you know, really, right now, the consequence of all this, and I know nobody looks at money supply anymore, but M1 is growing at a 30% rate these past 6 months. So that's a lot of quantitative easing. And to continue to do this forever and not talk about getting the tax rates down and get taxes lower with cutting spending, if we don't do that, all the QEs in the world won't solve our problems. It will eventually destroy our currency. And the world financial markets are not receiving what he's saying or doing what anybody else is saying or doing because they've all studied from the same economic textbooks. And I'd like to get them to think about free markets and how they should work.
Congressman Paul, let me ask you about another Bernanke statement. He maintains that inflation is not going to be a problem. This despite the fact that, as you may know, the consumer price index up 3.9% last 12 months. Oil and energy prices still historically rather high. He says inflation's not a problem, and therefore the door would be open to Fed easing. That was his implication. Your comment on inflation, sir?
Well, I think he's wrong, and I think the inflation is here because I start with the increase in the money supply, and I've already mentioned that. But I don't believe the government statistics on the CPI, because if you look at this from the old measurement of CPI, actually it's over 9%. And if you look at the unemployed and the low-income people, their inflation rate is always much higher. But if he's admitting it's almost 4% already, that's pretty big. And besides, he doesn't know exactly what the rate will be next year. I don't know. I don't believe you know exactly what it will be. It could be much, much worse because there's a lot of factors that go into pushing prices up. But we know that the stimulus has been put out there, and all we need to do is have a multiplier effect, and this thing could get way out of control. And eventually, I believe that's what's going to happen.
All right, $1.6 trillion in excess reserves on deposit at the Fed could go into it. Let me ask you about another one. Bernanke was asked about Republican criticism of his policies. You, of course, among them as a Fed expert. You've been very critical of Bernanke. They said, so what do you think? And he says, I don't listen to him. The Fed has to be independent. I want to ask you, what would a President, Paul, do? What do you think about the Fed, how to reform it?
Well, the whole thing is, to them, independence is one thing, but to me, that's secrecy, and I don't think it should be secret. Of course, my ultimate goal would be to diminish the power of the Fed to monetize debt, because that gives the incentive for the members of Congress to spend forever. If we didn't have the Fed to be the lender of last resort, interest rates would go up, and that would restrain the Congress. So in the meantime, because I can't get competing currencies going, I would say the more transparency, the better. And I think it's great that he's been forced to hold these press conferences. I think it's great that the country now in the last 3 or 4 years has come to look at the significance and the importance of monetary policy. 5, 10 years ago, I never dreamed this would happen. I think we're making great progress. The American people are now, with my arguments, that 65% believe now that we should have more transparency of the Fed, and that's why he's holding these press conferences. But he is going to be stubborn, because for him to do what I want him to do, he'd have to admit his whole career was misdirected. So that's not going to happen. Eventually, you'd have to have a new Fed chairman, at least to look at this thing differently.
Congressman, you have said, as I recall, this will be the last question, that if you were elected, you would not reappoint Bernanke. Is that the case?
Absolutely.
And who might you reappoint? I think you actually indicated a name at one point, did you not?
Yeah, I did the other day, and you may know him. And it's somebody that I've admired for a long time, very bright. He is known on Wall Street, and that's Jim Grant. And I think he's capable, because he is a free market person. He understands sound money. And I think if he had to work within the system, he would be able to restrain the Fed money machine as much as anybody else could.
All right, Jim Grant is an old friend of mine and a frequent guest on this program. Congressman Ron Paul, thank you for helping us, sir. Good luck on the campaign trail.
Thanks a lot.
All right, by the way, Jim Grant is a staunch advocate of gold. Interesting that Ron Paul would like to see Grant run the Fed.